This is just a quick plug for the Patreon. If you've pitched in already, I'm so thankful, and this extra content has been made possible by you. If you can't or don't want to, that's fine. You're still helping the show by watching. Thank you all very much. On with the show. Hi, I'm Hamish Black, and this is Meditations, a slightly more opinion-based version of writing on games. This week, I want to return to the topic of Hitman. The second episode was released this week, and sees 47 infiltrating an underground lab in Sapienza in order to eliminate 2 targets and destroy a virus that is going to, I don't know, kill people better than you, I guess. If you watch my previous episode on Hitman, you'll know that I absolutely adore this game's open approach to mission structure and how the game allows the player to experiment on a fundamental level with the game's systems and AI patterns, allowing for a sense of improvisation that few games facilitate. I believe that this allows the player to craft their own narratives so that each map or target essentially becomes anthological in style in a way that completely overrides the main narrative, as I will explain later in this video. What you will also glean from that video is that I advise waiting until the full game is released to actually purchase it. Now that this second episode has been released, however, I've been left feeling unbelievably conflicted about my position on this. Do I think you should go and throw all your money on it this second? No. I just think that the implementation of an episodic release structure for this particular game, and judging by only 2 episodes, could be one of the best things to actually happen to it. Now let me clarify, the reasons I'm about to discuss here are not necessarily what IO Interactive or Square Enix envisioned when they decided to make Hitman episodic. In fact, given the latter's track record with game delays and a more profit-driven focus, which is understandable given their nature as a large corporation, I would say that the reasons for the episodic structure were likely far shadier than what I'm about to go into, if not entirely separate. I would be willing to guess that Square Enix went to IO and told them that they were making Hitman episodic so it would make more sense in terms of investment, and that IO essentially did their best to make it work in their favour. What I'm going to consider here today, and this may seem strange to some, is that the episodic nature of Hitman, whilst faltering in some areas, actually makes more sense for this game in particular than if it were to be released as a whole package. Now, bear with me here. I know some people are dead against it because of the presumed shady nature of the business dealings I speculated on just there. But whilst I believe that to be a valid reason for people choosing not to support this game at this stage, I want to separate the business from the core design of the game. With that in mind, however, I'm going to analyse the episodic structure in terms of how it affects the gameplay and narrative, rather than how it affects consumers or Square Enix's business plan. To begin, I believe that the key reason the episodic nature of Hitman works is due to the unbelievable replayability afforded by its level design. I'll state up front that on average I've put in over 7 hours per main mission, only slightly less for the smaller training missions, and I've barely scratched the surface of the Sapienza mission. There exist full $60 AAA games that don't provide that much content in a linear experience, let alone the vast array of methods with which the player can carry out their objectives in this game. As I stated in my last Hitman video, these tools provided to the player are not just different weapons or stealth mechanics, but full-blown opportunities for the player to completely change the moment-to-moment narrative and gameplay of the mission they are almost constructing themselves. As I say, I've put multiple hours into this recently released mission, and have barely seen all of the different areas of the map, or the multiple ways in which the mission can be carried out. So far though, these opportunities have ranged from awaking in a morgue and stealing the outfit of a scientist mourning her colleague to gain access to the underground lab, to assuming the identity of a golf coach with whom one of the targets is having an affair, to going on an almost slapstick level crusade to convince the neurotic businessman I'm supposed to kill of his mother's ghostly presence on the anniversary of her death. Why does the episodic nature encourage this kind of experimentation though? And why does it ultimately benefit the experience? Well, for me personally, my first experience through the mission, and I'm willing to bet the experience of many others as well, was a bungled mess in which I barely made it out alive, and saw a fraction of the content of the level. I explored the first opportunity I could find, which, as I stated in my last video, the opportunities have the potential to be disappointingly scripted, and merely happened across my second and third targets in a fairly confined space. What I saw on that first playthrough was what I would say was about an eighth of what the level has to offer. Were I playing another Hitman title, and this was the case with almost every Hitman game I've ever played, or any title with a clear through line of progression, the incentive would be clear. To carry on, to rush on to the next piece of content. I would imagine most players would appreciate the open nature of the maps, and would probably say to themselves that they would come back to explore other options later on, but given the seemingly transient nature with which most people view games nowadays, constantly moving on to the next release and the like, I would be willing to bet that that would never happen. In reducing the scale to a map-by-map basis, the player is forced to explore these levels if they want to get any amount of value out of their purchase. This could be argued as being restrictive, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that, but due to the way in which the methods of completing the player's mission differ so greatly and almost fundamentally change the way the game is played, it turns what would normally be seen as just a level in a larger progression into a full-fledged, self-contained experience. The dynamics of the Paris fashion show, in which 47 is mainly tasked with blending into a large crowd, differ greatly to those provided in Sapienza's seaside town, in which crowds are more sparse and every citizen seems to be going about their own separate business, as opposed to the people at the fashion show who are in the one place for ultimately the same reason. The ways in which the player chooses to go about their mission, whether following the scripted opportunities or messing with AI procedures in order to block the circuit as it were, that is to say to gradually isolate the target before striking the final blow, allows the player to craft their own narratives within these levels. Is 47 a consummate professional dealing with his targets as efficiently and effectively as possible? Or is he a slapstick idiot blundering his way from one barely survived encounter to another? The game's episodic structure allows each episode to have its own short but satisfying narrative arc, with the plot of each being controlled by the player and the mechanical tools they have at their disposal. It makes Hitman an anthology of sorts, and given the quality of the gameplay and the way in which the mechanics link into this self-contained narrative the player is constructing, this episodic anthological approach makes the game a deeper, more satisfying experience for the player. And it's a good thing too, because one thing the episodic nature of the game does not help is the sorry excuse for an overarching narrative presented here. Of course, we are only 2 episodes in, so it's hard to tell whether or not the story the game tries to tell will be effectively brought back round to create something meaningful, but as it stands, the episodic nature of the game does such a good job of bringing the scale of the narrative down to the player's control, with an easily defined A to B plot, in which A is the player deciding where to go, and B is the objective of that map being completed, that when it goes back to the overarching narrative cutscenes at the end of the mission, it's perhaps the most disjointed a game's narrative has seemed to be in a long time. Lately I've been reading a lot of theory on the purpose of making a narrative episodic and the quote-unquote rules one should follow when making a narrative episodic. For example, modular narratives in contemporary cinema by Alan Cameron is well worth a read if you're into that sort of thing. And Hitman fails at this on almost every discernible level. I mean, it was Aristotle who said that of all plots and actions, the episodic are the worst. I call a plot episodic in which the episodes or acts succeed one another without probable or necessary sequence. Those words there describe the narrative of Hitman to a T. At this stage in the game's overarching narrative, if it weren't for the occasional cursory mention of the organisations involved in the hits, the story would be literally entirely unrelated to anything the player has seen or done. Now, I would give a spoiler warning here, but honestly there really isn't anything to spoil. The cutscene at the end of the Sapienza mission literally makes no mention of 47 whatsoever, and focuses on one character the player only briefly saw at the end of episode 1, and another character we have no idea about who is promptly executed. The cutscene almost immediately descends into irrelevant nonsense. Well acted nonsense, but nonsense nonetheless. If the game wasn't episodic, then this would probably make more sense, as the overarching narrative could develop a whole lot quicker without having to wait a month to get a glimpse of something the player has absolutely no investment in that is almost entirely separate to the narrative the player experiences in-game.
But honestly, has the overarching narrative really ever been the driving force of a Hitman game? As far as I'm concerned, the stories in Hitman games have always been convoluted trash, designed to superficially guide the player from hit to hit, as they create their own absurd, far more compelling narratives within missions. I think the episodic nature of this latest release elevates that player-driven narrative to a level that far surpasses the story the developers are trying to force into the game, and as such, I believe that this latest release ultimately benefits from its episodic structure far more than it suffers for it. And with that said, that concludes the first episode in the Meditation series of writing on games. I'm incredibly excited to hear what you guys think of this development, and if it's something you'd like to see more or less of. Let me know in the comments below or by following me on Twitter at officialhamishb.
Now, in terms of the Patreon, your support has been unbelievable to me and has allowed me to justify spending more time doing this, hence the extra content. I'm now going to be aiming for 3 videos a month, 4 if I'm feeling particularly inspired. This is just a heads up so that if you want to set a monthly limit on how much you pledge, you won't be charged more than that regardless of the amount of content I create. You've put your trust in me by supporting the show. I couldn't dream of betraying that by having you pledge more than you can afford.
I'm still adapting to this whole Patreon thing, and I don't really know where it's all going to end up, so please discuss your ideas with me. You're now directly helping make this show happen, so I want you guys to be involved. And if you have taken something positive from the show and feel like you want to contribute to its production, then you can pledge your support at the link in the description. We've already reached our first goal, and that means I've been able to take ads off the channel entirely. The next goal is a podcast. If that's something you're interested in, please consider pitching in and spreading the word. As I always say though, don't worry if you can't, I'm not going anywhere. And with all of that said, I'm Hamish Black, and this has been a slightly different episode of Writing on Games. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.